Hey, this is Adam Stosky from Briefly, and I'm here with Matt Kugizaki from Inland Counties Legal Services as part of our Inland Counties Legal Services video series where we cover the basics of important legal issues. So today we're going to talk about something kind of interesting, which is about nonprofits and natural disasters and how nonprofits can essentially protect themselves and continue to operate during a disaster, which is sadly increasingly important in this day and age. So Matt, can you give us just an overview of the issue? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, the point of this is just to kind of create a checklist in your mind of things to do when you're not experiencing an emergency, a natural disaster, or really just a challenging time at your nonprofit. It doesn't have to be an earthquake or a fire that impacts your building to prepare for a stressful time. This is just to keep things kind of in place, kind of like a nonprofit checkup, so to speak.
All right. So why don't you walk us through it? Where do we start?
The first thing is for a nonprofit, as we know, we have a ton of different types of written documents. We have bylaws, we have contracts, we have all of these agreements that are helping us operate our nonprofit. One, make sure that you know where copies of those agreements are and make sure that you have the agreements in a physical place that'll be easy to access in the event that your building, you can't reach it, in the event that your servers are unavailable. Make sure that you know where you can get copies of it, just so that you can continue operations in that regard.
Right. So you kind of want both. You want a digital backup if you can't access things physically, and a physical backup if you can't access them digitally, essentially.
Totally. You want them in many places. You also want both places to be secure. I'm not suggesting that you just leave them on every desk. It's more of, yes, you want the digital and the physical copy, but obviously secured.
Okay. So what's next on our checklist?
I think with those contracts, you also want to make sure that they're current. Make sure that you understand what's in them. It's best practice just to review your agreements and your bylaws annually to make sure that if there's anything that needs to be changed, that you do that timely so that they're current, that they reflect the operations and everything you need to do. It's really easy for us when we're busy to kind of just let some things go in autopilot. And while contracts certainly what our obligations are and what we need to do under certain contracts and bylaws, maybe something that we don't need to keep updated. But if you're in a disaster situation, you're not going to have time to then go update everything, or that's going to be really challenging, I would say.
We've talked about, just access to documents. We talked about reviewing contracts. What's next?
A critical provision in your bylaws that you're going to want to take a look at, and also your contracts are, is there anything that you want to put in there in the event there's a disaster? For your bylaws, for example, you may want a provision that says how your board can convene meetings in the event people aren't able to convene in a physical space or under the schedule that they're doing in normal operations. So that's one thing. Also, in your agreements, you may want to understand how if you have a phone agreement with a company, what is going to happen in the event there's a disaster? Are you going to continue that? Is there a way to adjust what your services are in the event you need that adjustment because a disaster has forced you to make some operational changes?
Right. And a lot of contracts have force majeure provisions, right? Where they might be able to get out of an obligation in the event of an act of God. So it'd be interesting to look and see, those are real, right? And see what might be there.
Totally. They're real. And I think just mentioning the term force majeure, a lot of people are like, what is that? And if that is your reaction, I think it in general, that's what we want to do. Learn what your contracts mean, understand what they're saying. And I'm sure at one point when you entered into them or when someone at your organization did, they went through that with a lawyer. But it's always good to kind of refresh and make sure you understand exactly what you're supposed to be doing and what your rights and responsibilities are.
Okay, interesting. So, so what's next on our list?
I think if there's a disaster, you want to ensure that you want to recognize in the event of some disaster, your operations may have to change a little bit. But if they change, you still need to make sure you're maintaining your 501c3 or other tax-exempt status.
Right. So you have to still be fulfilling your charitable purpose. So if things radically change, you might need to get ahead of that in one way or another.
Exactly. I think that's essentially it. There's a lot of nuance to this, but exactly what you said is right. You want to make sure you're still adhering to the core purpose for which your nonprofit has been stood up to be. And you're not, if a disaster is happening and your mission is to help people in the community, then helping them in the event of disaster may totally align with your nonprofit purpose. But if your nonprofit purpose is something else and it's not as community facing, then changing your operations to go help people with disaster, like with housing and other things, if that's not part of your purpose, it may disalign with what you're supposed to be doing and put your nonprofit status at risk.
So it's really just a matter, I think, at that point of getting in touch with a lawyer and figuring out how to communicate with the IRS about what the changes are.
Totally. I mean, another thing that goes into this, which you mentioned IRS, and that triggered in my mind donations. During a disaster, sometimes you may want to be a way to collect donations on behalf of your organization or the community to help people. And it could be from from great, it could be from absolutely perfect motivations. But if it's not done in accordance with the law, you're also going to be putting your nonprofit status at risk as well.
Right. So scrutinizing donations that may come in during the disaster.
Yeah, and just understanding if you're allowed to receive donations, how you're allowed to do that, if you have the infrastructure set up to make sure that you're providing the information to donors, that it's going to an account, it's used for the purposes that you'll need to use. All of this stuff, it may be, I think the trick is in a disaster, your operations may change and you may be doing a lot of things and you may come in your mind like, look, I now want to accept more donations from these types of organizations for these purposes. And you may be able to do that, but to ensure that you are able to do that under the law, you should talk with an attorney if you're going to change your operations.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, is there anything else on our list?
I think the one other thing I would add is just employment laws, because some things or sometimes in the event of a disaster, your staffing needs change. You may need to bring on temporary employees. You may need to bring on volunteers. You may need to expand your staff or lay off certain members of your staff because you're in a whole completely different situation. And all of those things I just mentioned, laying off staff, bringing on staff, volunteers, part-time workers, temp workers, all trigger in your mind different types of employment laws that you may not have considered. You may have never brought on temporary workers, but now you need to do that. And there are laws that regulate exactly how you're able to do that, how you'll have to pay them, and on and on.
Okay, great. Wow, really interesting. So anything else, or have we covered everything, every major issue on our list?
The one other thing I would add about volunteers is that you want to make sure that a lot of people bring on volunteers, but if you start controlling what they're doing, you may provide housing or meals or other things for them in the event of disaster. You could be edging toward an actual employment relationship. So it's just something I want to caution you of. In a disaster, one of the wonderful things about community, there are often a lot of people that are willing to step up and volunteer. But in employment law, sometimes a volunteer can become an employee if you inadvertently or accidentally treat them as such. And if that happens, then you may be on the hook for actually paying them, even if you never really contemplated that. I'm not saying that to scare you. It doesn't happen all the time, but it could. So it's just more of a caution to be careful if that happens.
Yeah, you could totally see it happening, right? You have these volunteers, some are really good, and then you begin to maybe, give them some benefits, suddenly some money, and before you know it, you could be, really edging towards, as you said, that employer-employee relationship.
Absolutely.
Great. All right. So is there anything else to add on this before we close out?
The only thing I'll add is there are a lot more issues that you're going to want to do. You're going to want to address beforehand and in the event of disaster. And so I would just recommend that you talk with your lawyer. You make sure that you're organized. You make sure that you have things there. But just because we didn't cover it today doesn't mean that it could be an issue that pops up.
Great. All right, Matt. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.